7. The best worst year ever. Learning to weather the storms. Have you ever heard of Saturn's return? I first learned about it on set from Jenna Ushkowitz, who talked about it a lot during the year she turned 28. Saturn's return is an astrological concept that basically says that in your late 20s, when the planet Saturn completes an orbit around the sun, it bitch slaps you and turns your life into a total shit show. It's not fun, but if you can ride it out and not lose your mind, then there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Clarity. At least that's how it worked for me. Thank God. To rewind a bit, I met my ex-fiancé, aka Big Sean, on Twitter. I know. So 2013 of us, right? While filming Glee, I was bored on set one day and tweeted something about a song of his. I didn't even really know anything about him, I just liked his music, so I didn't think that much about it. Then later that day, he DM'd me. "Thanks, lady, I'm a big fan of yours too. Keep up the good work." Whoa, I thought. He watches Glee? I was sitting with Leah between takes and I read her the message. "Oh my God," I said. "Am I going to date this rapper?" She shrugged. "Maybe?" And then sure enough, that was exactly what happened. Sean was on an international tour at the time, so we started talking on Twitter, and after I gave him my number, texting. Soon we progressed to real live phone calls. I was living in Beverly Hills at the time, and my house was this weird black hole with no cell reception. Lucy, my dog, got a lot of walks in those days because the park was the only place where my phone seemed to work. He'd call me whenever he had downtime, and we cycled through all the normal getting-to-know-you topics: music, work, family, friends. Every once in a while, he'd try to be slutty, and I always shut him down real fast. "Oh, you're going to spin class? You must know how to ride." "This is going nowhere if you keep talking like that," I'd threaten. Even before we'd met in person, I was really excited about it. It was fun to tell people who I was talking to. They'd always freak out. "The rapper? No way!" The day he finally got back into town, he called me and asked me to go to dinner. A real date. I liked that. We went to Dominic's on Beverly, and he pulled up in a white Mercedes. Sean was a few years younger than me, but he seemed mature from the beginning. I remember thinking it was really classy that he had a Goyard wallet. I had a Goyard suitcase, and I thought, that's a different kind of rapper. Most rappers just know about Louis Vuitton. I liked how he wasn't super flashy, and the conversation flowed well through dinner. His mom was an English teacher, and he was smart and articulate, and it felt like we had a lot in common. We were even born in the same hospital in Santa Monica. When he talked about getting signed, it was cool to see that he was as passionate as I was about making it. He also didn't seem like one of those guys who's just into hearing himself talk. He actually asked me questions too, and really listened when I told stories. At the end of the night, as we stood outside waiting for the valet to bring our cars around, he asked me if I wanted to come over tomorrow. Whoa. 1, he wasn't trying to sleep with me on the first date, and 2, we already had a second date scheduled. Cheers to that. The next day, I took him up on his offer and went over to his house. We watched Netflix, made out, and I spent the night. Then I woke up in a panic at 6 a.m. It was like one of those cartoon wake-ups where your eyes pop open and you gasp and bolt upright in bed. Had I really just spent the night with a rapper? Rap ho was not the look I was going for, so with my shoes in hand, I snuck out of his house while he was still asleep. There was a marathon in Los Angeles that day. Streets were closed and traffic was rerouted in all kinds of directions, and I remember thinking that I was never going to get home. Not only had I made a terrible mistake, but I was also going to die in my car on Sunset Boulevard barefoot and gasping for water. As I always did in those kinds of situations, I called my mom to talk me off the ledge. I honestly thought I was never going to hear from him again, but I'd barely gotten home when he called me and asked me to come to his birthday party. It was the next night, and I had nothing to wear. I bought a brand new Mason Martin Margiela jumpsuit, and they had to fly my size in from New York. The party was at Wolfgang's Steakhouse in Beverly Hills, and Sean's whole family had come in from Detroit for the occasion. I went alone and took a deep breath as I walked in the door. There were all kinds of people there whom I recognized, like Wiz Khalifa and Janae Aiko. I found Sean, wished him a happy birthday, and asked where I was sitting. As I scanned the room, I wondered how many of these other girls he was hooking up with and how much work it had taken to make sure we were all seated at different tables. "Oh," he said, "you're next to me." I choked on my champagne. Next to him meant the inner circle table. What's more, I was right across from his mom. I imagined her asking me how I knew her son. Well, I'd say, "We met on Twitter and hooked up 2 nights ago." I downed the rest of my glass. I didn't need to worry, though, as dinner wasn't awkward at all. His mom turned out to be really into alternative medicine, and we talked about colonics the whole night. Neither one of us was the kind of person who finds talking about colonics awkward, and I even promised to hook her up with my girl the next time she was in town. It was only a day or 2 later that Sean had to do a radio interview with Power 106 in Los Angeles. The DJ was teasing him, asking him who was the hottest girl he'd ever been with. I was driving down the freeway at the time listening because he'd told me about it, and when he didn't miss a beat and immediately said, "Naya, I almost wrecked my car." I remember looking at the lady in the car next to me and wondering, does she know what just happened? Well, if Sean and I weren't official, we were at least public. And then it became official not too long after that. One night we were at his house, sitting on the couch, when he turned to me and said, "Naya, will you be my girlfriend?" No one had asked me that since elementary school, and I was thrilled. Great, I thought, got a boyfriend now. Check that box off. I think Sean fell in love very quickly. And it was genuine, even if in retrospect it seemed like a child falling in love with a new toy. But I was equally swept up in it. He was fancy. He had a big personality and always liked to be at the center of attention wherever he went. So when his attention was on me, it made me feel like, well, at least $3 million. He sang to me, and when he rapped about me in a Drake song, "My new girl on Glee and shit, probably making more money than me and shit," it made me so proud, because I felt like he was proud of me. Dudes, if there are any of you reading this book, piece of advice here. Being supportive of a woman's career and aspirations is a guaranteed way to knock her off her feet. After 6 months of dating, we were engaged. We were in Detroit when he decided to pop the question. I don't think he'd given it much thought. I'd flown out for one of his shows, which was a big deal to him because this was his hometown, so he knew tons of people there, and it was a crowd that had always supported his career. He wanted to blow their minds, but instead, a whole bunch of technical problems turned the show into a complete disaster. He was really upset about the whole thing, and I felt bad for him. Back at the hotel, we had a long heart-to-heart, just sitting on the balcony and talking for hours. I tried to be the epitome of a supportive girlfriend that night, as I talked him up and tried to lift his spirits. "Who cares?" I said, and reminded him that it was just one bad show in a string of awesome ones. Overall, he was still doing great. My pep talk must have worked a little too well, because later that night, when we were in bed about to fall asleep, he rolled over and nudged me awake. "Hey," he said, "do you want to get married?" What? I was suddenly no longer sleepy but wide awake and totally incredulous. Was he seriously asking me that right now? Where was my ring? Where was my anything? I thought he was joking, which I also thought was a totally asshole-ish thing to do, and so we got into a huge fight. I even grabbed my pillow and tried to sleep in the other room. Eventually, he sweet-talked me back into bed and also into agreeing to marry him. Okay, so we're going to get married. Or whatever. He could be quite the charmer when he wanted to be, but since I still wasn't 100% convinced that he was serious, I didn't want to let myself get too excited. The next morning, we were having breakfast with all his people and his mom, who I hadn't seen since the steakhouse colonic discussion. Without consulting me and in between bites of waffles, he announced to the entire table that we were engaged. "Well, that's not a surprise," his mom squealed as I spilled my coffee. Just like that, I had a fiancé. Once we got back to LA, he officially proposed, complete with a private dinner at his house and a drive that ended back at the site of our first date. But the ring was barely sparkling on my finger for a minute before the problems became too big to ignore. For starters, it seemed like he spent more time out of state than in it. I hadn't minded his constant travel or the physical distance all that much before, but now that we were planning a wedding that was his idea in the first place, not being able to get a hold of him was more than just an annoyance. It was a serious issue. Once the wedding became something real, it seemed like he wanted no part of it. I couldn't even get a guest list from him, which was a double pain in the ass because all these rappers had aliases. Like I knew what Wiz's real name was. So there I was trying to be a grown-up about a grown-up thing and navigate all the practicalities like, where are we going to live? Are you going to move into this house or should I sell this house? Let's get this prenup signed. But I was doing it all on my own, and I might as well have been blasting my texts straight into outer space for all the response I was getting. I was starting to see that the realities of a relationship just weren't sexy to a rapper who wanted to have his cake and not just eat it too, but spread frosting all over the place. Too much? Sorry, not sorry. Naturally, we started to fight. The more disinterested he acted, the more I'd pull back and try to freeze him out or just get pissed off, though neither tactic ever seemed to lead to any kind of resolution. Once, we'd been fighting for 5 days straight while he was traveling, and then on the one day that he was back in LA, he said he didn't want to see me. I was like, well, asshole, I've got a key to your house, so I'm just going to come see you. I walk in, go downstairs, and guess what little girl is sitting cross-legged on the couch listening to music? Come on, people. I'm not going to tell you, but you can guess because it's not that hard. It rhymes with Schmariana Schmonday if you're really having a hard time. Finally, he suggested we go to couples therapy. I wasn't entirely enthusiastic about the idea because I felt like he'd messed things up and was now trying to get me to help him fix it. But against my better judgment, yes, I know, again, I agreed. For our first therapy session, he was late. I was sitting there like a truant kid in the principal's office as the therapist kept asking, is he lost? Should I call him? After 25 minutes of being alone at couples therapy, he showed up, wearing an all-over weed print sweatshirt with a giant picture of 4 asses in thongs on the front. That was the shirt he'd chosen to wear to try to work our issues out? It was so ridiculous that I might have even laughed had I not been so mad and embarrassed. Also, it wasn't like we could even begin to work out our issues because the session was half over by the time he got there. The next time, he was prompt, but when I brought up a major issue we'd had, he went ballistic. Listening to his reaction to what I thought was a very valid concern, I almost blacked out, like, I'm supposed to marry this person sitting next to me? Who is this person? The panic rising in my throat, I blurted out, this isn't going to work. We don't belong together. Wow, he said. Do you really feel that way? Yeah, I answered. Right now I do. Finally, he was being serious and hearing me out, and after a conversation, we decided together to postpone the wedding. But back to that whole him not dealing with real life thing. When you postpone a wedding, there's money involved, and we'd already sent out our save the dates. We had to pick out a new time to get married, but before we could, he left town again. Then I was stuck with my mom and wedding planners calling me to ask when the new date was, and all I had to tell them was, I don't know. But even with all that, I was still in, amazingly enough. Then, the straw that broke the camel's back was a Rolex. On our third date, he'd given me a Rolex watch, a fancy gift that I'd initially resisted. It wasn't my style, but he pressed it on me as it was something he'd had for a minute and now wanted to pass on to me. Shortly before everything started to go down in flames, he'd asked me to start wearing it more often, so it was in my regular rotation, and I always kept it in the same place. But this time, when I went to look for it, the Rolex was gone. Call it woman's intuition, but I knew immediately what or who had happened to it. In my mind, taking something from someone's house without telling them amounts to theft, even if it is something you gave them. If he'd wanted it back, all he had to do was ask. I was pissed, and it was another WTF moment in this rapidly deteriorating relationship. Are you stealing things from me now? I asked when I called him, and he stammered that the only reason he'd taken the watch was to get it rewound. Likely story. People had seen him wearing the watch, and he'd even had it on when he took my brother to a Dodgers game. In one of my weakest moments of all time, I tweeted about it. And alas, between our millions of combined followers, such a tweet did not go unnoticed, even when I realized what I had done and deleted it as fast as I could. That tweet shall henceforth be known as the one time I showed my ass on Twitter. He responded in kind, but in a way bigger fashion. He had his publicist release a statement saying the wedding wasn't just postponed, but that he'd decided to call it off. So I learned that I was no longer getting married from the internet, and at the same time as the rest of the world. And not only were we no longer getting married, but apparently we weren't even together anymore. You know that thing you do in 6th grade where you have your best friend break up with your boyfriend for you? This was like that, times a million. And we were adults. Well, at least one of us was. It wasn't like your typical celebrity breakup where a couple releases a joint statement yammering on about irreconcilable differences. Instead, he did it on his own and basically said, "Yep, dump that bitch." It was sad and beyond hurtful, but at least the relationship had finally come to an end. I didn't love him enough to become a better person, and it was clear that he didn't love me enough to boss up either. As soon as I calmed down enough to take a step back, I could see exactly what had driven our relationship, and why it hadn't worked. We liked the glitz and glam that came with being together more than we actually liked each other. When I heard the word engagement, I thought marriage, babies, picket fence, albeit a really fancy picket fence, but I guess he was just thinking publicity. At the time, I didn't really pick up on this, though, because I was so caught up in it. I'd lose track of whose event was whose. When we were going to a party or had a photo shoot, I didn't know whether the invite had come from my publicist or his. Either way, he got his picture taken, and I brushed off the fact that I no longer did anything on my own. I just thought, oh, we're a dynamic power couple. Of course we're here together. It became clear to me that a lot of things he did in the name of being supportive were really just attempts to share the spotlight. When I had a single drop and it was my turn to do an interview at Power 106, Sean showed up with a bottle of champagne. "Just here to support you, babe." But then why are you on the mic? Why are you answering questions about my song? I guess that's his MO. Flash forward to him on the Grammys red carpet with Shmariana. It was her first time being nominated, and now when she looks back at pictures of that night, he's going to be in all of them. And they're not even together anymore. Just stop. If you're really a supportive man, then you know when to step aside and let your lady be the center of attention. You don't need to literally stand in front of her to prove you were there. You can just as easily make your point from the sidelines. As soon as my relationship with Sean was over, I recognized that this was a good thing. I think deep down I had always had little twinges of doubt here and there, but man, do I wish I would have paid attention to them. I would have saved myself a whole lot of trouble. I don't fuck with you either. I've only seen Sean once after he released the statement about how we were no longer getting married. With that, he raised the stakes, and now that I'd seen how bad things could get, I was willing to wave the white flag. I called him and asked him to meet me in person, and we sat on Mulholland in my car and talked. I was ready for a truce, and my one request was that he not put my name in shit. "Do not write songs about me," I begged, "because people are already going to assume you're talking about me, so just downplay it as much as possible." He promised me that he would never do that, and assured me that he was not that kind of person. At this point, I'd heard the beginnings of "I Don't Fuck With You," which was just a beat and a chorus. I actually thought it had the potential to be one of those awesome LA songs that really defines the summer. I was a fan of it, but I had to bring it up. "Please don't make the lyrics about a relationship." He was aghast that I would even suggest such a thing. "That song's not even about a relationship," he said. "There are plenty of things people don't fuck with. Some people don't fuck with steak. Some people don't fuck with pot roast." What the hell was he talking about? "Are you kidding?" I asked. It can be about how you don't fuck with kale. Just please, please don't let it have the words ex or girl in it. He agreed, 100%. The song dropped a few months later. Bitch, I don't give a fuck about you or anything that you do. I heard you got a new man. I see you taking a pic. What the hell? Once again, the gossip sites were churning out headlines and my mother was calling me and yelling into the phone. Why does that fool's name come up every time I Google my kids? Damn it. So, I was an adult who had dated a child. I learned from that. And now, I have a rap song about me. That's almost as good as a star on the Walk of Fame, right? There is such a thing as bad PR. If there's one thing gossip sites love, wait, make that two things they love. 1, gossip, duh. And 2, kicking a lady when she's down. My newly single self was ripe for both. These sites were reporting that Sean called off the engagement because I was jealous and controlling and that I had violent fits of anger. Let me tell you about the first time I almost had a violent fit of anger when I read that. Another story had me yelling at him and saying, if you don't listen to what I say, I'll ruin your career. I mean, who says something like that? No one, that's who. And especially not me. You know it's time to take the BS seriously when your publicist wants to have a conference call. For a couple of days it seemed like I was on the phone non-stop, but in the end I decided not to release a statement of my own. I was already sick of dealing with it, and I hoped that if I stayed quiet and kept it classy, lesson learned Twitter, the whole thing would soon blow over. Then Sean and I could keep it moving and get on with lives that no longer included each other. At the same time, I decided I was going to make the best out of my love life, suddenly being in shambles, and focus all that extra energy on my career. Keep it professional. Then that also hit the fan. And the gossip pages. It was the end of Glee's 5th season, and it had been a rough year. Everyone who worked on the show was already stressed. To say that Glee means a lot to me is an understatement, and there are a lot of people who worked on that show who I love dearly. Chris Colfer is one of them. He's not only a talented performer, but he's also a best-selling author and just a generally amazing human being. When we were on set, in between takes, he'd be off in a corner writing novels in longhand in a notebook. I don't know how he did it, but it's incredibly inspiring. At the producer's request, Chris had written the second-to-last episode of the season. It was a pretty big deal for him and for the show. The days we shot were crazy, with even more mayhem than usual. 2 of Chris's favorite things are animals and old people. See? I told you he's amazing. And he made sure that this episode included plenty of both. There were 3-legged dogs running around and legends like Tim Conway on set. However, all this caused one particular Glee star to amp up her bitch factor. She made a huge deal about the dogs and demanded hand sanitizer anytime one came near her. While the rest of us were in hysterics over Tim Conway's constant improvising, it was throwing her off. Instead of just rolling with it, she kept interrupting. So, are we gonna do the scene as it's written now? Come on, if Tim Conway wants to improvise, you let him improvise. He'd even brought his granddaughter to the set because she was such a Glee fan, and she ended up crying because she couldn't understand why someone was being such a bitch to her grandpa. Finally, my co-star gave up, locked herself in her trailer, and refused to come out. Trust me, I would have been fine with her staying in there, maybe forever, but the sad truth was that we couldn't film without her. People were pulling their hair out and yelling into their walkie-talkies can we get her back on set? Can we get her out of her trailer? We were shooting a scene in a diner, and all the producers and crew were in a huddle. No one knew what was going on, and absolutely nothing was happening. Meanwhile, one of the producers was just perched on a stool at the counter, like we were in a real diner, and he just stopped by for a milkshake. When I started at Glee, the producers told us 3 things. Show up on time, know your lines, and hit your mark. So I listened. I take that kind of stuff seriously. And I know that as much as acting is about performing and having a big personality, it's also about doing a good job. I never dropped a line in 6 years of working on the show. So there I was. I'm on time. I know my lines and I'm on my mark. And I'm the only one. I wasn't trying to be Captain Save-A-Ho, but as you've probably realized by now, I'm a blunt person. So when things get to a boiling point, like they were that day in the diner full of dogs, I am going to say something. So I walked up to our producer and said, "Are you going to do anything about this?" He looked at me like he had no idea what I was talking about. "Where are the other people in this scene?" I asked him, gesturing at all the empty chairs around me. And I added, "You're on my mark, so if you would kindly get up and handle something, anything, that would be awesome." He lost it and started screaming at me in front of the crew. "I've been running this show for 6 years," he yelled. Without raising my voice, I responded, "Yes, poorly." Ooh, girl, wrong thing to say, 'cause after that, Nene didn't get asked back to work. By the time I woke up the next morning, every gossip site in Hollywood seemed to be cutting and pasting the headline, "Naya Rivera fired from Glee." Oh, crap. So now not only did the world know I was dumped, but it also thought I got fired in the same week. But I hadn't actually gotten fired, not even close. The producer just said he needed a break, and during the summer hiatus, we met, and he apologized. I accepted and apologized too. I now know that you're not supposed to tell your boss they're doing a poor job, but I also let him know I didn't think my one comment warranted the smear campaign. I told him that, to be quite honest, I felt like I was under attack. He insisted they had nothing to do with the rumors, and reading between the lines, it sounded like there was a giant blinking arrow pointing right at a certain person. So I guess you can throw a bitch fit, lock yourself in your trailer, install production, yet still allegedly find the time to leak stories to the press. I nodded. Well, I thought, that person doesn't write my lines or my checks, so I don't give a flying fuck, and we're moving on. The unexpected silver lining to a really horrible time in your life is that it can actually be somewhat empowering. It makes you realize how much control you do have. Not over what is happening, but over how you choose to see it. So I could sit there and be depressed and feel like a victim, or I could pick myself up and get on with it. If I have a personal philosophy, it's keep it moving. So that's exactly what I did. Figuring out the God stuff. The first thing I did to keep it moving was actually to stop. I needed to be with myself and be quiet and let the storm pass. One of the weirdest things about being an entertainer is that it's a constant push and pull between look at me, and no, don't look at me. Picture me passing out on a fainting couch as I wailed that last line. You can get so drunk on fame and all the fanciness of being the center of attention that you forget all the attention doesn't just vanish as soon as you're over it. I was going to have to keep my head high and deal with this mess, and the only way to do so was to detach. I had to forget about my ex, forget about people on the internet, forget about my co-stars. I had to just be with myself, and with God. For 2 weeks, I barely left the house. Now, I don't want this to sound sad, like I was curled up in bed in dirty sweatpants, stuffing my face with Doritos. I still took the time to brush my hair, but I also just took some time to reflect. There's a difference between keeping it moving and just doing things to distract yourself. I knew that running myself ragged wouldn't help me move in a productive way. It'd just leave me burned out or totally crazy, and I'd just end up looking like Amanda Bynes on a bad day. Physically, she walks around a lot, but she does not keep it moving. Poor girl. The last thing I wanted to do was party it up and give the tabloids something else to sink their teeth into. I also took advantage of this time to start to pray a lot and go to church. I really think that whoever you are and whatever you believe in, you need to find something that gets you to a calmer place and makes you feel refreshed. It's edifying. For some people, that thing is yoga, or reading self-help or philosophy books. But for me, it's church. I'm Christian and grew up going to church, and the principles of Christianity have always resonated with me. When I was growing up, my mom and dad had very different views on religion, and I respect both of them. My mom became a devout Christian when I was about 7. She started to watch the Trinity Broadcasting Network and refused to let my brother and I listen to secular music. When I would perform at school talent shows, I could only sing Christian songs, which, let's be honest, didn't really bring the house down at a public junior high. My dad had been raised a Jehovah's Witness but had no desire to continue down that path as an adult. He had looked into Buddhism for a while and frequently meditated, but on the whole, he wasn't a fan of organized religion. Whenever he saw my mom loading us into the car on a Sunday morning, he liked to point out to us kids that we didn't have to just automatically assume we were Christians and that there were other things out there. So, file religion under another thing that drove a wedge between my parents. I completely understand where my dad was coming from. Religion and spirituality should be about your personal relationship with God. But for me, I didn't need to look around or search for anything, because Christianity had felt right from the beginning. Going to church felt good. What I learned there made sense, and I felt a real connection to God. Whenever I go to church or pray, I feel refreshed, and afterward, the whole world seems a lot clearer. By the time I was a teenager, my mom had loosened the leash a little bit, and going to church was no longer something she was going to force us to do. But I still always found my way back to it. Whenever I would realize that I wasn't praying or wasn't reading the Bible anymore, it felt like I was dropping my relationship with God. I would always notice that when I started to do this, things would also stop working out, or I didn't feel right in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The year 2014 was a wake-up call. For the past 2 years, everything had moved at the speed of light, and they were going so well that I had forgotten that they could get bad. Whenever there's commotion and noise in my life, I go back to the Bible and my relationship with God, and that steers me where I need to go. I think that's pretty typical for a lot of people, and it takes something bad to remind us that connecting with our spirituality and our own inner strength is something we should be doing on a consistent, not just as needed basis. When I prayed, I made it a point to say, "Thank you for this time," because I know that something good is going to come out of it, and I know that I need to calm down right now. I didn't want to pray like this. "Things are so bad, get me out of it." I wanted to be grateful, because taking things for granted is a great way to turn yourself into a lazy bitch. When you get to that point, you stop appreciating the things you do have and quit working for the things you don't. For me, the words, "Be still in the Lord," ring very true. When I talk to God now, I try to strip away all the problems and anxieties that I want resolved and instead focus on the bigger underlying issues. Like, what decisions did I make that led me to this place? I never ask God to fix things for me or to make things go away, only to give me guidance so I can become a better person and fix them myself. I do believe that God has a plan for everyone and that our lives are predetermined. So if I believed that God was steering my ship, why was I always trying to steer everyone else's? I had to learn how to trust and to mind my own business at the same time. God has a plan, and even if I think that plan is really shitty at first, I have to trust that it will all work out in the end. In this case, it did, and even better than I could have imagined. I love a good elopement. It was during this time that Ryan came back into my life. He'd seen the headlines and heard the gossip and sent me an email. "Hey, I heard about all this stuff and it seems pretty shitty. I was a fan of his music before you guys were together. I just want to make sure you're okay, so let me know if you want to talk." As with everything that happened with Ryan, the timing was eerily perfect. The day before, my sister had been at my house and I was randomly Insta-stalking him. He was always so nice, why don't you date him again? So, when his email landed in my inbox, I looked up his phone number, called him, and asked if he wanted to meet up. He did. And it was that night that I told him about the abortion. When he slept over, I remember being really nervous and climbing into bed wearing a hoodie that he zipped up to my neck. I turned my back to him and just went to sleep. I didn't want us to just hook up and then have that be that. I felt like I'd just crawled through the fire, and getting burned had taught me that I was ready for something real. Ryan was real. Shortly after, he left to shoot a movie in Albuquerque. I went to visit him, and that was when we fell crazy in love. It was one of the best times of my life. I went to the set with him one day and just sat there and watched him work. It felt so nice to be on the sidelines and watch someone else work, especially someone who is as passionate about what he does as Ryan is. Albuquerque, New Mexico is a lot like Valencia, California. There's a BJ's and a Chili's and a Target and not much else. We went to all those places, shopping for snacks or eating fried artichokes and having a blast. We once spent hours just reading magazines and looking at books in a Barnes & Noble, then bought booze at the local liquor store and just hung out in his hotel room. No one knew who we were, which was a relief. I flew back to LA, and before I knew it, I'd planned another trip back to see Ryan. The night I returned to Albuquerque, we sat in BJ's, our new favorite restaurant, for hours just talking about serious life stuff, marriage, kids, what we'd seen our parents do and what we'd learned from that, what we wanted for ourselves. Jokingly, I asked, "So, are we getting married?" But he answered me seriously. "Well," he said, "I don't know," which was not a no. We continued to talk about it, and when I was back in Los Angeles, he called me one night. "Let's do this. We're getting married." Hell yes. The next day I had lunch with my mom. "So how was Albuquerque?" she asked. "It was good," I said. "So I think we're going to have a wedding in Mexico?" Now, mind you, my mom at this point had been hearing Ryan's name for 4 years but had never actually met him. I half expected her to reach across the table and slap me. Instead, she was thrilled. "Oh my God," she squealed. "Naya, that's so perfect." Like I said before, my mom has had my back through plenty of ups and downs. But she went on to tell me that since Ryan and I had started dating again, I'd seemed calmer and more secure than she'd ever seen me before. He treated me well, and it brought out my best qualities. With him, she thought, I acted my age, not my shoe size. Mom was all for it. After that, Ryan and I fast-tracked and met each other's families. No matter how weirded out they were, they all came. My stepdad told me that he didn't think it was really going to happen, but that if it did, he would be there. My brother took some convincing because he thought we were crazy, but in the end, he walked me down the sand aisle. We got married at Las Ventanas, a beautiful resort in Cabo. After all the press I'd been through with my previous breakup, I worked extra hard to make sure the wedding wasn't going to be covered by the media until I was good and ready for it. We told the resort that the ceremony was a vow renewal for my mother and her husband, which worked out great, except they write the bride's and groom's names in the sand. A representative kept calling and asking, "What's your mom's name?" And I'd always find a way to put them off. I'll just give you the names when I get there, okay?" Just because you don't know about something doesn't mean it's a secret. All our caution paid off. No one crashed the wedding, and it didn't hit the press until we announced it. All the gossip sites acted like put-out babies because they hadn't known about it in advance. The headlines called it a surprise or secret that came out of nowhere. They suggested that I'd kept the same wedding and just swapped out the groom, which is truly #triflin'. Sean and I were supposed to get married in Santa Barbara, not Mexico. And Ryan and I didn't get married on the same date. We got married on Ryan's birthday. I had bought a Carolina Herrera dress for my wedding with Sean and wore Monique Lillier when I married Ryan. Still trying to sell that Carolina Herrera dress, actually. DM me on Twitter if you're interested. Good price, I promise. What's more, just because we didn't send TMZ an engraved invitation doesn't mean we were keeping it a secret. Everyone who mattered to us knew about it in advance, and many of them were there to be part of it. And it definitely didn't come out of nowhere. The truth was quite the opposite. It was really 4 years in the making, and next to when my son was born, it was the best day of my life. 2014 didn't turn out so bad after all. Sorry. Falling in love with the idea of a person instead of the actual person. Ignoring my intuition and staying in a relationship that I knew deep down wasn't right. Putting someone on blast in a public way rather than talking about it one-on-one, aka showing my ass on Twitter. Getting snappy with my boss instead of just taking a deep breath and deciding to STFU. Not sorry. About that broken off engagement, best thing that ever happened to me. Praying with gratitude as opposed to just asking God to make the bad stuff go away. Trusting that every shitstorm has a silver lining. Taking responsibility for my actions and apologizing to my boss. Planning a secret wedding that included all the people we cared about and only those people. Laughing at the gossip instead of getting upset by it. Same wedding dress, my ass.